The 1970 U.S. Census Resource Material. Welcome. You have been selected as one of the many persons who will work on the 1970 censuses of population and housing. We hope this video will prepare you for that census. This is another JDW Talks. My targeted audience for this one are census researchers, future users of the 1970 census in 2042. And why 2042? Because in April, that census will become public. Users of 1970 census data. There is a website there that you can find out more about me. It also has links to scans of census documents you won't find elsewhere on the internet. And I am going to show you a number of links to 1970 census documents that you can get. So here is a topic outline that I intend to accomplish. Talk a little bit about the basics of census research, 1970 census facts and logistics. We'll talk about the short and long forms, which are, the long form is a sampling form, some of the questions, and then we'll look at some of the workers that were involved in that enumeration, and I'll show you some references at the end. So for those just starting your research, and even the old pros here, let's go over some basics of census and this 19th federal census. The federal census is mandated by the U.S. Constitution. It's in the Constitution. It's taken every 10 years since 1790, and the questions may differ between the years. There's some questions, obviously, that are the same, especially recently. There is a 72-year privacy period, so that the 1970 census should become public on April 1st, 2042. And people think for some reason that the 72-year rule is based upon life expectancy. It is not. It is not. I have a YouTube video on this subject that discusses the history of the 72-year rule, and it's really a precedent that was set by the director of the census and the archivist of the United States. So here are some definitions that you would need. Obviously, a census is a count. The person doing the count is the enumerator, and that process is an enumeration. So the enumeration is the process of taking the count by enumerators. The enumeration district, which is the smallest unit of the census, at least it was in 1970, is one of about 300,000 small geographical areas into which the country is divided for the purpose of taking the census. And I think that I got directly from one of the manuals. There are a number of questionnaires. They're mainly the short form and two varieties of long forms. And it's interesting that now it's questionnaires, but in the past we will be talking about census schedules. The federal census is used to reapportion the House of Representatives, and since 1913 the number of seats is fixed at 435. So after a census, some states may lose seats, some may gain seats, depending upon movement of population and increasing of population in one state versus another. There are a number of other reasons why the federal census is important. As you can see here, a number of the states use the census to reapportion their own legislative bodies. It's a planning document for schools and community needs. You might want to find out where to put elementary schools, where to put factories or offices, where to do housing programs. It's a estimation of manpower available to various industries and defense. And a lot of people analyze census information on the economics and social effects of population growth, shifts, etc. It's a marketing tool for a number of people, and it's important to distribute federal funds to the states based upon their populations. So let me tell you a couple of facts about 1970 census and some of the logistics as well. I'm not going to cover a great number of these. The 1970 population of the United States was over 203 million people. That was an increase over 1960 of about 13%. However, between the 1950 and 1960, the population grew by 18.5%. That was the baby boom. And so this reduction of population growth was considered to be due to the baby bust, a lower birth rate, and later marriages. There was a lot of dissemination of data in electronic form for use by researchers and the public. Getting into an information age here. There were obviously privacy controls in place with this information, so there's no reference to household names or addresses. And there was a major increase in analysis of the information and the amount of statistics tabulated, especially for small geographical areas. One thing that people found out was that, and it became a major problem, was there was an undercount. There were a number of people who were missed on this census, as in previous ones. They did better, but the undercount is estimated at 2.5% in 1970. However, there was a differential undercount in that minority groups, such as blacks, were missed much higher than white Americans, as you can see from the statistics I'm presenting. And it was recognized that it was a major problem that needed addressing in subsequent censuses. And there's a good book by Anderson and Feinberg about this problem. This was the first census that had a mail-out-mail-back format for large cities. So this mail-out-mail-back census forms were for the population and housing census, and what happened was they were pre-addressed to households. Name of the household person was not there, and it was delivered to about 60% of the nation's housing units on March 28, 1970. And those mostly city dwellers filled it out themselves, and then were asked to mail it back to the Census District Office on April 1st. And I'll show you the forms that were used. Here is a map showing you where the mail-out, mail-back areas were. They were in major urban areas and some cases adjoining counties. The mailing lists were from commercial sources, augmented by checks both by the postal carriers, because they were given cards to say, is this address correct? Did we get every address? And by census field staff. This self-enumeration approach was estimated to reduce the needed numbers of enumerators by about 1/5, or about 100,000 jobs. And with that extra savings there, they put it into analysis and experimentation of the census. Now, you need to know some terms about how the cities dealt with the census forms. And most of my documents that you're going to see are based upon the cities. And you can see here that there were two different approaches, a decentralized and a centralized approach. And when I show you various documents, most of them are going to be decentralized documents. So in most mail areas, when the mail was returned with the forms, that they were returned to local district offices, and the enumerators handled these questionnaires for their assigned areas. And they looked at them, edited them, follow up on them, etc. On the other hand, in core areas of very large cities, and this was about 21 of the largest cities, the inner city area covered about 12% of the population. What happened was there were district managers there that were full-time professional staff, and therefore it was a much more intensive operation, and they looked at the census forms coming in. If there were clerks and enumerators there, they were under close supervision. In other words, it was centralized in terms of the process. So keep that in mind. The remainder of the country, the 40% that did not get this mail out, mail back, did get the mail out. So they got the short form questionnaires in the mail. The postal people gave them it. They filled it out, and then they were told to not mail it back, but to keep it until an enumerator came to pick it up. And when the enumerator came, in one of 5 households, there was some further sampling that was done by that enumerator. So we have a conventional census here, and I don't have much documentation on how that was trained, handbooks, etc. Those mainly rural areas had an address list constructed by enumerators as they went along in something called an address register. And the address registers were very important because they not only had lists of people there, they also had things like callbacks, respondent addresses, and other logistics. So this is something we're not going to be able to see, but it was an important aspect and set up future censuses, especially in rural areas. So the Bureau was in the process in 1970 of developing very complex geographical coding systems that led to, with computers, a very advanced look at an area, so that the Census Bureau would be able to answer how many people lived on the east side of Oak Street between Maine and Commonwealth, for instance. Before that, they could not tell you that. Afterwards, they had that information. So here, and as part of my kits that I have, is that an address register. It says it's non-mail areas, so it might be the conventional one. They had in here a blank address register, a map of the enumeration district, supply of blank questionnaires, etc. Now, I've changed the background to blue because some of the documents I've scanned and you're going to be able to get, and if the background was brown of the slide, I have it, but I haven't put it online. And so here is the tiny URL, a small address, which is actually leads to a Dropbox account, and where you can pick up this address register book for non-mail respondents. So throughout this talk, I'm going to tell you how to get actual documents. So please acknowledge JDW Talks if you use them. Initially, I had a single kit, probably from a 1970 district supervisor, and after I had seeded the slides for this talk, another kit came online at an auction site that had the questionnaire manual that I wanted, so I got it. And then when I was just about to add narration to the slide deck, another kit came online, which I bought from an actual 1970 crew leader. And so I got that with a lot of new manuals that he had. And so this is a combination of that. He also had a blank carrying case. So that's why you see 4 cases in this picture, but it represents 3 different enumerators. So let's look at the short and long forms. And here I've given you links so that you can get PDF files that I have scanned, actually using OCR as well, and put on my Dropbox account. Now, something about these terms, all these forms, manuals, etc., had a specific number, like D2, D11. And D11 actually is the same as D1, but D11 was used for the conventional census area, while D1, D2, D3 we use for city areas, and I'm going to show you the difference between them. So D1 and D11 have the same questions, but the how they're used is a little bit different. And so here, if in D11 on the front page, it tells you that after you have filled out the form, that then keep this form in a safe, convenient place until the census taker calls. So the D11, D12, D13 we use for that conventional census. On the other hand, the instructions on D1, D2, D3 indicate to the respondent to mail back this form on Wednesday, April 1st, and use the enclosed envelope, which they had. No stamp is needed. Okay, so the forms are the same in terms of the questions, but how their process was different. So the short form, or the 100% sample, was asked, the questions were asked in every household. And the questions were also asked on the long form. But 80% of 80 out of 100 households got the short form only. So they only had these 5, I think about 5 questions. Not very much. They asked for the name of the person, relationship to head of household, the sex of the person, the color or race, month and year of birth, and marital status. That's for the population part. There were over a dozen housing questions also asked on the short form. So the enumerator handbook indicated that the short form for a family of 4 would take about 15 minutes to fill out, while additional questions on the long form would take additional 30 minutes. And in areas of substantial Spanish-speaking households, an instruction sheet in Spanish was included. Most of them had this instruction sheet. Again, that's a brown background of the slide. So again, you should know that I have these forms, this information, but I'm not putting them online, except in this talk, of course. So here's your instruction sheet. It tells them how to fill it out. And here is the short form. I know it's a short form because on the upper right corner, it just shows page 1. And there's no circle or triangle like the long forms, as you will see. So this contains the population questions, the 5 of them, and then some of the housing questions as well. And this is actually the D11 form. So if you see number 4, it says keep this form in a safe, convenient place until the census taker calls. However, the inside is exactly the same between D1 and D11. Here is answer these questions for each person in your household. And note that this form is for a single household. This isn't like the old census forms where people are listed in a number of lines, and a number of households might be represented on a single sheet. But in 1970, each household got their own form. And so one household for one questionnaire. Now, the way the forms were filled out in 1970 was that the respondents filled in with pencil circles that were their answers. In 1960, respondents got a questionnaire, and the enumerator transferred the answers to a form called a FOSDIC form, which had the circles. So there was some concern in 1970, and this is from the Anderson book, and I'll quote that doing this by the public themselves could be intimidating for those with lower education or literacy levels. They couldn't follow instructions, as well as for older persons with sight problems. And the FOSDIC forms were then filmed and then read and put into magnetic tape. So what is FOSDIC? Well, the first thing I thought about was this person who is FOSDIC. He was an Al Cap cartoon character. You might remember him, some of you. Al Cap also did Little Abner. And he was Fearless FOSDIC. It was a takeoff of the Dick Tracy cartoons. But that's not FOSDIC, because this FOSDIC has a K. FOSDIC is a film optical sensing device for input to computers. So what happens is the FOSDIC form is filmed, and then this piece of equipment takes the film and transfers the information, sees the filled in circles to magnetic tape, and the magnetic tape feeds into the computer. It was said that this eliminates the phase of census processing that required the transfer and key punching, remember the old key punch cards, of all the pen and pencil answers on the census form to punch cards for tabulation. So the 1950 census was an example of it, and you could get, you didn't need all those people who were creating punch cards. However, because the public was now filling out these circles, it was expected that about 20% of the short forms and about 3/4 of the long forms would have problems and would need to be edited or followed up because of errors. I'll show you some errors in a second. So the procedure was that in the cities that the questionnaires would be returned, that they would be checked in and compared against address books or etc. And that's, as you can see, this is a decentralized mail. So that's the first step. And then the next step would be to look at the short forms, if you had the short forms, and to edit them, because you could detect a number of errors. For instance, in that short form edit instructions, you can see here that the respondent made check marks or put X's down, did not fill in the box in those circles well. And the solution for the person doing this checking, this enumerator, is that says these marks are not acceptable because FOSDIC is not going to be able to read them. So fill the correct circles, erase, or if you cannot erase, cover with white dots any marks that cross into additional circles, because you couldn't have any extraneous marks on the questionnaires that would throw off the system. So you have to do a lot of cleaning up of these census forms. I am giving you in my Dropbox account those check-in instructions and also the short form edit instructions that you can have for yourself. These are on my Dropbox accounts. You should grab them when you can, because who knows what's going to happen in the future. Okay. Let's look at the long form. The short form went to 80% of households. The long form, the sampling form, went to 20%, 1 out of 5. It included all the questions on the short form, plus a common set of sample questions. Now, remember that for the conventional people, the 40% of the U.S. that didn't have mail-out-mail-back forms, they got the short form in the mail. And then when the enumerator came, the enumerator in 1 out of 5 households sampled them. So the long form includes all the questions on the short form. Remember, this is for large cities, plus a common set of sample questions. But the Census Bureau decided to do something even more. They put a special subset of questions in 3/4 of the long forms. That's about 15% of the total U.S. households. So that's one subset of questions. And they put a different subset of questions in 1/4 of the long forms, or that's 5% of the total U.S. households. So therefore, the long form had samples of 20%, 15%, and 5% of the total U.S. households for different questions over the short form questions. Kind of a complicated and ambitious approach to the census, and that generated a large number of administrative levels and handbooks and manuals and forms, etc., as you will see. It really was quite amazed me at the amount of material that had to support all of this. So here is an example of the long form. How do I know it's the long form? Because I look in the upper right and there is a symbol there, a triangle, indicating that that long form was the 15% sample, and or a round dark circle, that's the 5%. So together these two forms were given to 1 out of 5 households. And remember, the background is blue, so I've already given you a link to these, I think these two forms. The long form and the information, well, let's look at this quote, I think is an important quote, that the information required for congressional apportionment purposes and that needed for city blocks will be collected on a 100% basis. You want to know how many people there are in the United States. Information which is to be tabulated for areas as small as census tracts and most counties will be on a 15% or 20% sample basis. The 5% sample will provide statistics for larger cities, standard metropolitan statistical areas, larger counties, and states. So here we have a situation where some of the information in the census, 100%, is used for one purpose, or the sampling is used for other purposes. Now, there is a very nice publication on data collection forms and procedures. I've taken this table from them. It shows you the population data items collected and where they are. Either 100%, everybody was able to answer those questions, 20%, i.e. just the long forms, or then 15% or 5%. So there's the population data items collected. Here is the housing data items with the same situation. You can find that in that reference. And those references are repeated at the end of this talk. The long form had its own edit instructions, and this again is decentralized. And so again, they had to go through it to make sure that the circles were filled in properly with a lead pencil. And I have given you a scan of the long form edit instructions. Get them while you can. So remember that the forms D11 and D12 and D13 have the same questions as D1, D2, and D3 as used in large cities, but these were given to the conventional census areas to hold for an enumerator. So all of these decentralized, centralized would be based upon D1, D2, D3, and all of the conventional areas of the U.S., that 40%, would be on D11, D12, and D13. I hope that's clear. So let me show you some of the questions. I've always been interested in how questions are picked in terms of this, and many questions were submitted by lobby groups. They were ruled out as not being in the broad public interest, which is the first criteria for inclusion. A second criteria was there must be something that people could answer. Some were vetoed as too complex or too personal. So in one of the publications on the bottom, the rejected census questions, you could read them. Things like automobile accidents, musical instruments, smoking. You know, smoking might be important because the census has been used to correlate health of a person with various aspects of an area. Do you believe in God? Do you own a dog, a cat? Here's some other ones that were rejected: child spacing, number of household pets, hospitalization during previous year. You know, that might be an interesting one too in terms of the health professionals. Availability of off-street parking. Social Security numbers are protected. They would never be on a census. You'd never be asked for your Social Security number. There is a very nice table in this reference source which shows you the difference between the 1960 and 1970 census and the sorts of information that was asked. And this, I think, is from Kaplan. Yes, Kaplan 1970. And if you're interested in this aspect of the 1970 census, I highly recommend getting that reference. There were a number of new 1970 inquiries: Spanish origin or descent. What were you doing 5 years ago? An interesting one, which surprised me: health condition or disability that limited the kind of amount of work the person could do. Vocational training, kitchen facilities, owning second or vacation homes, etc. One question that I've been following the last couple of censuses is this one. It was asked on the long form, the 15% sample, which is, where were you born? And the instructions are, if you were born in a hospital, give the state or country where the mother lived, not the location of the hospital. And that was also done in 1950 and 1960. They were trying to figure out a statistic about how people moved, and I think this is the reason why they did it this way. It's going to drive genealogists crazy because they may see a state of birth listed for a person that is really wrong. It's not factual. The questions are all in this questionnaire reference book, and I think every enumerator got a copy of this. And as you see, it's a blue background of the slide, so that means that this questionnaire reference book I've scanned and I put it online. And most of what I've scanned is not available any other place. So grab them now, especially this one. Let's turn our attention to the people who actually ran the census, at least the ones who were in the field. There were 13,000 district staff, 12,000 crew leaders, and 160,000 enumerators. Those are approximate figures. That doesn't include all the people who analyzed the information. And I'm going to go through this and show you some interesting documents I have. Most of them I've not put online, but obviously they're here on this video. And one of the kits that I have had a list of forms, a checklist of forms. You can see pages and pages. Incredible the amount of administration and forms. And that checklist I've put online for you on my Dropbox account. I also added the manuals and handbooks of the checklist that I have because that's not even on that list of forms. And if you need scans of particular 1970 forms that I have, contact me. I'm easily found on the internet. In terms of genealogy, there are a bunch of Joel Weintraubs. You don't want a medical humorist or a dentist or a rabbi. That's not me. So contact me with information on what form you want and how you are going to use the material. This data collection forms and procedures that I told you was a really good reference also shows some forms there, especially forms that were done to get information from the public. So let's look at the district supervisor. There is obviously a manual, office operations manual, decentralized. I have not put this online. And it's interesting, all these manuals have an emphasis on safety. You can see on the bottom here, handle paper carefully to avoid paper cuts. If you carry pencils around in your hand, keep the point away from you. I'm not so sure that's a good idea. You're going to be stabbing somebody, more likely than stabbing yourself, perhaps. And then about straight pins. So it's really kind of cute to see these sorts of cartoonist ways of trying to cut down on accidents. So here's one form. You look on the upper left, that's form D127. It shows the operations involved, the descriptions. Look at all the district offices, what they are responsible for. And there are forms on forms. The district manager was responsible for setting up the district and for training clerks, getting and training clerks, and getting crew leaders. And so here is a form D135 that did that. In terms of enumerators, the district manager could hire them as well, but most of them, it looks like, were done by the crew leaders. Here is a district office record, which has the crew leader's name on the left and the number of assignments, so they're keeping track of the crew leaders. And there are lots of my documents that concerned accidents and how to report them. Um, so here is an automobile accident on the left. Look at that, all the accidents on the right, etc. Looks like a dangerous thing to do a census. So let's look at the crew leaders. Now, outside of the large cities, there was about one crew leader for 15 enumerators. But in the centralized district offices in large cities, the number ranged from only about 7 to 10 enumerators per crew leader. Remember, it was more of a professional staff that looked at those mail-out-mail-back forms. If the district did not provide enough enumerators, the crew leader was required to complete the staffing. And there is a checklist for what a crew leader needed to do. That's D195 that I have put online for you. And here is the first page, the name of the crew leader, etc. If you go to the bottom, you see that the crew leader even had to locate training space for training the enumerators and maybe even select the enumerators as well. So they would have to go out and find a place that would have training. Presumably it would be free. And that this is D195. And, typical. So there's a form here. I don't see the form number. It's probably, oh, there it is in the upper right. D280. That says, thank you for donating the space. There's a form for everything here. And of course, being a public document, it has 2 copies. As part of the crew leader's responsibilities, they had to figure out if there were any special places in their district, because there was a teen night, a transient night, where they went out to transient places, hotels, etc., with very specific identification, or an M night, which is a mission night, jails, flop houses, etc. Very interesting situation there. So interesting that I have provided you with the Enumerator's Handbook for the large cities, both decentralized and centralized mail. And a special place was where people stay that are different from the usual private home or apartment and require different census procedures. Examples of special places are hotels, hospitals, jails, orphanages, mental institutions, and college dormitories. College students are enumerated at their residence at their college, not where their parents are. And also included in this category are large rooming and boarding houses. And there is the linkage to that special places handbook. Here's another part of that crew leader responsibilities, identifying oversized assignments. Now that's important because the crew leader could find out that they misjudged the size of the enumeration district, and they needed to tell the supervisor that, and perhaps they would split it. And I have an interest in split EDs. The crew leader reports on the enumerator, evaluates them all the time. You can see here, here's one report. Does the enumerator have a plan? Did they introduce themselves properly? So the crew leader must be going along with some of the enumerators when they actually did their surveys. Here's an enumerator assignment and progress record. An incredible number of forms that I have. Luckily, I have not only, this is all from the supervisor kit. Crew leader report and enumeration. Crew leader field quality check. The enumerator couldn't get paid until the crew leader signed off that he did an adequate job. And then the crew leader could hire enumerators. And in order to do that, there were some very specific things that had to be done, including giving the enumerator, potential enumerator, an exam. This is test B on the upper right. There are general instructions shown. And then there are a series of parts to this exam. I have given you a link to test B. I want to take a look at that. See if you could pass it. The test came in versions A and B with the same questions but different order. There's also a form that I have titled Instructions and Keys for Field Employee Selection Aids. If I were to teach a class on the census, I would have that class take the exam just for fun. And the areas tested in this exam were basic arithmetic, following directions, math problems, vocabulary, and reading. So if you're interested in this, I have scanned the A version exam and also the instructions and keys that I'd be willing to give you if you want to do this in a class situation. How long did it take? Well, let me tell you. So if I was an instructor here, the instruction and keys tell me, I look at the people taking the exam, you have 30 minutes to work on this test. I will tell you when 10 minutes are left in the test period, and again when 5 minutes are left, blah, 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 blah. I will not be able to answer any questions after the test starts, blah, 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 blah. When you finish your test, please remain in your seat until the test time is up. And look at this, it's a script. Everybody who gives the exam says the same thing. Let's look at the enumerators, the people who carried out some of the work, usually follow-up people. But in a conventional area, the enumerators pick up the short form, and if that household is one of the sampling households, ask the question. So look at this, be a census taker, earn extra money. There was a major push to get enumerators for the census, especially from minority areas, minority groups. Your responsibility, your pay, your training, your duties. So you want to be an enumerator? Are you a U.S. citizen, 18 years or older? Be able to understand written and spoken instructions, i.e. take an exam. Be able to do simple arithmetic. Be able to walk a lot, climb stairs. Work on your feet, see and hear well. Can you pass that written test? How much are you going to make? Enumerators were generally paid by piece rates, although sometimes they might be paid by the hour. That would be unusual. And the piece rates were designed to average about $2 per hour. Your assignment would last about 3 to 4 weeks. And here is a payroll voucher for an enumerator. It tells you all of the piecemeal information. You also paid for your training time as well. Also mileage if you had to drive around in a rural area. If you were picked to be an enumerator in 1970, you would get this brochure, which we started the video with, and it says that you'll be given training, and the training would be in a particular place. Now notice the training for this decentralized group started on April 8th. The actual enumeration started on April 1st. But this is, remember, the mail-out-mail-back system. And this is not the conventional, basically rural area. And so here is an indication of training times. In the conventional area, the enumerators went to work pretty fast. And so they were trained before the census date, that April 1st. In the centralized areas, that professional staff were working, and they basically needed enumerators to go out to redo really badly done forms or people who did not respond. However, in the decentralized area, the enumerators were responsible for getting the questionnaires, reviewing them, reviewing the long forms if needed be, etc. So that was a little bit more complicated, and so and you will see that in a second. So the crew leader has, of course, D613, a guide for training enumerators in the decentralized area, the check-in, the short form, the long form edits. Those are the first three things. The training schedule is shown here, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. These are not consecutive. Remember my previous slide. The first one would start on April 8th. And it was all scripted. Good morning, my name is Joel Weintraub. I will be your supervisor during this part of the 1970 Census of Population and Housing. My job is to train you and help you with any problems you may have in your work. As I call your name, please raise your hand. And then it tells you what to do. And then later on, when we get to day 4, there's a special part here on the follow-ups. You can see here, this is a heavy-duty part with their breaks and lunch, etc. And again, a script. Good morning. As I call your name, please raise your hand, etc., etc. Today, I'm going to teach you how to follow up on the questionnaire in your assignment that failed edit. Look at that. There's even places to pause. Pause, pause. Surprised there's not a place here to blow your nose. Now, I do have 2 enumerator handbooks, one of them for centralized mail, one for decentralized. That centralized mail and the questionnaire was one kit that I wanted. That was the second kit I purchased online. So you can get those handbooks as well. Have a pretty good background. If you're teaching a class in the 1970 census, I would think these are going to be invaluable. And here's some of the forms that I have. Number of listings and address register. Address register is an important aspect. Safety practices. The Hatch Act. The Hatch Act bans most forms of political activity by federal employees, including the holding of political office. And they had to revise this in the handbooks of enumerators. While they were enumerating, they couldn't do any politicking. But that didn't exclude people who held political office. They originally said it did. So you could hold political office and still be an enumerator, but you couldn't engage in political activity when you were in the field. And then finally, one other form called an individual census report. It was used to enumerate transients or guests in a housing unit or hotel or motel who had no one at their home addresses to report them to a census taker, lodgers or roomers at a housing unit, etc. The ICR contained all the population questions, including the sample questions. And the ICR was perforated so that it could be torn in such a way that if you were in a household that was the short sample form, you could just give them that first page. Or if they were in a long form, you would give them the entire document. Show you what that looks like next. Here's the individual census form. It may not be clear, but that panel on the right does have a way of being torn off. This is the front of it, where it will show you a place to where this person is normally, and eventually this form will get to that area, so they will be enumerated where they should be. And then on the back of it, here on the very left, is what would be on the short form. So that panel there can be ripped out with the address. They would be sealed, put it in an envelope, and return it to the district office. And eventually it would get to the right place. Here are some references I've used. In some cases they're online, and I show you a link to that. And so, interesting census. If I live that long, I will be 100 years old, less 1 month when this comes out. And it'd be interesting if I do live that long to look back and see if this is still online. So this is another of my PowerPoint talks on JDW Talks. I have 8, counting this one, 8 U.S. and New York City Census presentations for genealogists and other researchers, including information on the 1950 census, which will become public in April of 2022. I have 5 Ellis Island talks, including how to find difficult people and the name change myth. And as some of you may know, I'm a professional biologist and emeritus professor. And I have an interest in ornithology and birding. I have 2 virtual birding field trips, 2 Life of the Naturalist Adolphus L. Heerman, and 4 birding optics talks also on YouTube. So I hope you have enjoyed this presentation, and I have certainly a lot more of them. These are not lightweight presentations. These are meant to be given to groups. So enjoy it. Thanks for coming, and you could always subscribe to this channel.